Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Good evening, audience, listeners, viewers, for joining us for another edition of Globespan 24x7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. And joining us tonight is our technical operator, as usual, Mr. Devin Bissoon. This evening, we are discussing emancipation. Today is July 31st, on the eve of emancipation, which is tomorrow, August 1st. In the past, we used to call it August Day, August 1st Day, and it had different names over the period of years. And but the right and proper term for it is Emancipation Day. It's being celebrated in Guyana, Trinidad, a number of other islands. Not every island, not every territory got emancipation on August 1st, but most of them did, including Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, among others. So this evening we'll be discussing emancipation, and then we will also reflect on the elections that took place Sunday gone in neighboring Venezuela that has implications for us here in Guyana. So once again, thank you all for joining us. And our main discussant tonight, as usual, is the brilliant Mr. Ravindra Dev, a scholar par excellence, a terrific writer, prolific writer, writes for several media houses in Guyana and around the region as well. So Mr. Dev, thank you for joining us tonight. And if we may begin the discussion, just tell us, what is emancipation all about?
Well, emancipation has been equated with freedom. It's not really, but and we'll get into that. But emancipation, as we talk about it, as we are commemorating it tomorrow, is a specific term that is applied to the enslaved Africans that had been dragged across the Atlantic, starting from the 16th century and used to labor on the plantations and in the mines in this so-called New World. And in the British colonies of the Caribbean and elsewhere, it was on August 1st, 1838, that these enslaved Africans were finally freed in the sense that they did not have to labor for nothing. They did not have to be subjugated to the whips and chains and racks that were used to coerce their labor on the plantations, sugar plantations, cotton plantations, coffee plantations, and as I said, in some territories, mines. Now, technically, and there is some confusion about this, and we ought to see the difference, is that the Emancipation Act was passed in England in 1833 and was supposed to take effect on August 1st, 1834. So one would say, well, isn't Why isn't 1834 the year of emancipation? Same August 1st, but why not 1834? Well, the reason is that after getting remunerated for owning these people whom they had enslaved, working them for their whole lives as chattel, which comes from the word cattle, property, the planters, the European planters, insisted that they need a period to transition into an economy of what they called free labor. So they were granted very generously by the British Parliament another 6 years. And they called those 6 years, ironically, apprenticeship. Now you may ask, apprenticeship is to train some people to work, you know. So here it was that these individuals had been working their whole lives at the jobs that they would be to continue, cutting cane, hoeing the cane beds, fertilizing the cane, working in the factories, and yet they were now being called apprentices. They would now be learning those work. And that's the kind of irony that the British had the power to do whatever they wanted and did so and named it accordingly. So coming back to our central point, what is emancipation? Starting in our case around 1616, when the Dutch started their first plantation up the Essequibo River using slave labor, all the way to 1838, August 1st, when the British finally declared these enslaved people to be free, to sell their labor and to be remunerated for their labor. It is called emancipation. They were now freed to sell their labor.
So we had over 200 years of slavery in Guyana and longer in other places. And as Mr. Dev rightly pointed out, there was discussion and debate for several years in the 1830s, early 1830s, to end slavery. The bill was passed in 1833, supposed to take effect in August 1st, 1834. But the slaves didn't get their freedom, and we use that in quotations, until August 1st, 1838. Now, following the end of slavery, cheap or virtually free labor was imported into Guyana under the indentureship system. So slavery is also very closely tied with indentureship that led to the Portuguese being brought to Guyana, then the East Indians, the Chinese, and African labor, African indentured laborers as well. So, Mr. Dev, you want to give a little clarification on that?
Well, before I get to that very, very significant question for our present future in Guyana, let me just mention part of the confusion between 1834 and 1838 led to a protest by Damon out in Essequibo, because Damon not unreasonably figured if there's been a proclamation called Emancipation, and on August 1st, 1834, well then, why aren't we free? And he then rose up and made that point. And he did what today we may call a passive resistance strike, even though the planter, Mr. McBean, went out and destroyed their hogs that they had been mining, destroyed some of the crops they had been planting, ravaged them, and yet they were said to be in the wrong. And Damon, as we know, was hung, and out in Georgetown, and this is why we have a statue of Damon out in front of the Anna Regina compound there to commemorate this individual from insisting that they should not play around so loosely with the word emancipation. So this confusion wasn't just an academic confusion as to the date of emancipation. It had very terrible consequences for these individuals out in Essequibo. But to come to your question now, the reason why emancipation is so significant for the Caribbean in the present is that the planters, ahead of the emancipation, they already insisted that the slaves would not work. The enslaved people would not work once they got their freedom, that they will then have a labor shortage. And as a matter of fact, even before the abolition of slavery, the planters over in Trinidad experimented with some Chinese that they brought, I think in the 1820s, as early as the 1820s, as indentured labor. And it did not work out, but they were already thinking about bringing in cheap labor. The point we want to make then is that upon emancipation, in those islands where the formerly enslaved people had no option, they had nowhere else to go, like in Antigua, they had to work. So in fact, slavery was abolished immediately. In it, there was no apprenticeship period because the planters knew that where are they gonna go in these small islands? In Guyana and in Trinidad, especially, however, where there was a lot of abundant land that these formerly enslaved people could have gone on and squatted on and tried to make a living, they figured that, hey, this is what will happen here. And that is why they planned, even before the actual end of the apprenticeship period in 1838, they brought in indentured servants, indentured laborers, starting with the Portuguese from Madeira. People keep on forgetting that, but the Portuguese from Madeira was very drought-stricken, poor country. Even though it was technically Portuguese who were European, they were very, very poor and very much downtrodden. And they leapt at the opportunity to come to a new land where they could make a living. So our first indentured laborers were the Portuguese from Madeira. So you can call them Madeirans or Portuguese, same background, but specifically from Madeira. And in fact, when I meet Portuguese in New York City, when I first come over, they would be horrified to say, well, they went as indentured servants to the Caribbean. No, sir, not us. Those are Madeirans. Of course, it all had to do with, you being almost like a slave. But interestingly also, it wasn't a matter of color at that point. These people just wanted, the planters just wanted cheap labor. So in fact, they tried some British laborers. They tried some Maltese. They tried some Germans, a sprinkling, but they didn't work out. And the Portuguese suffered tremendous deaths. They died like flies, literally. And that is something that is often overlooked in Guyana when we see the modern Portuguese doing well and all that. That didn't happen by magic. They really paid a price for whatever success they achieved in their death rates in those early years. They were followed by the Indians. In 1838, there was an experiment by our friend Mr. Gladstone, who owned several sugar plantations, cotton plantations also. And we all know of that, the Indians of Green Hoop and Bellevue, and some landed up in the Dawson plantation up the Berbice River in Highbury, and some in Waterloo over in West Coast Berbice, near Bard Settlement there. So that first experiment was also a disaster, and we knew that because, and that's the important thing. And so when people wanted to get a feel for what slave labor was like, there have been some accounts of what that was like, but the early Indians, those 400, 396 who landed from the 414 who left India, there is, and it was an investigation into their condition by 1839. And people gave evidence, and the workers themselves gave evidence, and they were treated like slaves. These planters didn't know different, and we see what was on in their heads. They wanted cheap labor, they wanted docile labor, and they wanted those labor to work from morning to night, as they say. And that was the Indians. They became, of course, the largest contingent of indentured laborers, and they were called coolies. But we in Guyana forget that the term coolie was also applied to Chinese, and that the British, even though they didn't own China, they shipped Chinese all across the world, and other countries also did. You had a whole ton of Chinese being shipped to Hawaii for their sugar industry out there. Cuba, believe it or not, about 100,000 Chinese indentures were shipped to Cuba. And so indentured labor became, in the planters' eyes, a necessity because they felt that the enslaved Africans after emancipation would not work on the sugar plantations. And in the case of Guyana and in Trinidad, that happened to be true because of the opportunities they had to go off on their own.
So slavery not only existed in the British territories, but also in the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, and in fact, in all colonial empires had slaves, as well as far away as in the Pacific Islands, the Indian Ocean Islands, there were slaves as well. In Reunion Island, for example, there was slavery, and not only African slaves, but there were also Indian slaves. And while slavery was happening and occurring, simultaneously, indentured labor, while there were Indian slaves and African slaves, indentured labor was introduced, contracted indentured labor was introduced in Reunion Island in 1828. And then later on in 1834 in Mauritius Island, which also had an abolition of slavery, where the Indians were taken in slave-like conditions. But I don't want to get into differences and similarities between indentureship and slavery. What I would like to focus on, if you could tell us from your experiences or your readings about how emancipation was celebrated and observed, because today there are big celebrations all over Guyana and in Trinidad as well, and tomorrow there will even be more massive celebrations. From your own perspective of experience, how was emancipation observed, commemorated in Guyana?
Well, let me just allude to what you said of the different slavery existing in other parts of the world. And it's an important point, Vish, which you have evoked there, which is that in a broader scale, in the development of capitalism, starting with the European conquest of the so-called New World, their thrust, as in all capitalism, including today, was to obtain labor as cheaply as possible. So in fact, the first indentured were whites. The Irish, after the potato famine of 1840, and even before, millions of them were shipped across, into America and into the Caribbean. Even today in Barbados, they're called redlegs, and they're not seen as quite, white. In fact, they were called white niggers, excuse the term, in the American South. They work side by side with enslaved Africans. So if we want not to get away from the human aspect, but from a position of labor, because in getting cheaper and cheaper labor, we can talk of labor as a commodity, but labor is something embodied literally in people's body, in human bodies. So you cannot separate labor from people. And that is the dilemma we face. So the impetus has been from the days of feudalism, where the lord of the manor could do whatever he wanted with his serfs. And then you had, the servants and masters act in England, giving them some freedom. There's been a constant evolution in labor fighting for its quote unquote freedom. And I would warrant you, Dr. Vishnu, is that even today in the modern world, when we see labor being shipped or themselves voluntarily, for example, pouring into America as HB1 visa, it's nothing but a form of indentureship. All these Indians coming in as IT people into America, what are they doing? They're working for less than the whites in those same positions. Mm-hmm. They're working, they have to ask for their children and family to come in. They have differential rights. And all of that is exactly what happened to indenture. So it's something we should think about, not just dismiss. But coming back.
And if I may, before you continue, Italians and Irish were brought to the Americas, Argentina, to Brazil, and the Germans as well. Well, the Germans came much later after World War I, World War II. But there are Koreans and Japanese who were also taken as laborers across South America and in some of the islands in the Pacific as well.
This is why you have a Fujimori become president of Peru.
That's right.
Who the heck do you have a Japanese guy being president of Peru? And if you go to Brazil, there are hundreds of thousands of Japanese,
and Koreans.
And Koreans. And to your question about how is it being celebrated, my personal experience, when you ask me about that, I come from the village of Iflat. It's a mixed village. And after the abolition of slavery, the enslaved Africans who were now freed, they moved out from that part of what we call the lodges, right adjacent to the sugar factory. And it was called, and I will say the word, it's not politically correct today, but without any freedom. Martin Carter talks about we all come from the nigger yards. Well, in Iflat, there was a part called the nigger yard, which was just southwest of the factory. And the people from those quarters, the lodges were there, and they moved out from the lodges, and they went towards the public road, which was about 3/4 of a mile away, because the plantations of Guyana are built that you have the seawall, then you had a public road, then you have some land that was left vacant, and then you had the factory. That was to protect the factory from the water that may breach the sea dam. So that public road was also a barrier. So our freed Africans in Iflat moved to next to the public road. And if you look at old maps of Iflat, it is still called the village. They bought lots in that area. It's called a proprietary village. They didn't buy the whole village like in Buxton or Victoria or so on. Those villages where they bought portions called lots was called proprietary villages. And in Iflat, that is how Iflat Public Road was settled. And later, and it's a whole big story, portions of it was called Kashwa. So today people will hear about Iflat Kashwa. So, but how did they celebrate? As a boy, I remember that you had Emancipation Day being commemorated. Emancipation Day was commemorated rather gaily because it was a celebration that you were now free. You could now do your own thing. And that freedom was translated into doing what you were prohibited to do when you were enslaved, right? Because there you were always supposed to be laboring. So the kinds of performances that I saw was some kind of dancing we now know is called cracker dancing. As a boy, I did know all the names and so on, but all I know that a good time was had by one and all. And even today, in my village, people of my generation, friends who grew up in that section of Kashmir, African Guyanese friends, they would come from wherever they are, out in Mackenzie or wherever they had migrated internally, and they would come back to the village to engage in the festivities.
Yeah, so it was a day for reflection, genuflection, celebration, commemoration. There were activities all over. There were prayers, traditional prayers from what the slave that passed down to their progenitors that they brought with them from Africa and from wherever else. I mean, I remember them watching them doing various kinds of dancing that subsequently I learned about when I was studying in the United States when I had African dance courses. But I always remember and look forward for the day. We used to call it August Monday. I don't know if that also was in your area, but in Portland we used to call it August Monday.
August Monday. It was called August Monday.
August Monday.
Right. First of all, it was August Monday.
Right. So it was the first Monday in August, and there will be turf club races that we look forward to, that we will go. And also it was some new Bollywood movie would be introduced that weekend. So we go to the Bollywood movies as well. I don't know if in West Coast they had those kind of activities. And in that period of time, even Africans would come to the Bollywood movies as well, and everyone would go to the races, both Indian, African, other groups in Port Moran Turf Club.
Well, what you're alluding to, and it's something that is very, very important to me, something very troubling for me, that the race riots of the 1960s, and I've spoken about this so many times on this program, was very traumatic to me because we lived together, we slept together, we played together, we went to the seawall and bathed together. All our activities as boys, we did together. You know, it didn't matter, as we say, you liked girls. It didn't matter with race, in my case. And that is how growing up was. But those riots of the 60s split us asunder. And very sadly, up to today, it has not healed completely. And to my consternation, there are elements in Guyana who, rather than healing it by talking about a common vision, one in which all of us have an equal place, as the Trinidad motto speaks, somehow we are seeing all kinds of divisions still being promulgated in Guyana. I find it very sad, and it's something that we need to guard against and to talk out against and to work against.
Emancipation and indentureship are very, very important historical events that we should know about. And unfortunately, not much studies or time is being devoted in schools today to learn about these events. You can't understand who you are unless you know much about indentureship and slavery that preceded indentureship. Unfortunately, in our school system, not much time. You have any ideas, suggestions, commentaries about how this can be tackled and addressed?
Well, sadly, it is nothing new. Those who struggled, fought for, worked towards independence, part of that whole discourse of being independent, the very word independent, which is a natural consequence of emancipation, if one thinks about it. Emancipation meant you weren't slaves anymore. You could sell your labor. But the country was still run by those same planters and the British who listened to the planters. So independence, in my mind, is there's a line that you can draw, which is its natural consequence. And therefore, independence, if it meant anything at all, should have meant a whole new discourse about our own history, because it was very clear that when the British were ruling, they told their story. And for instance, they talked about enslaving us and indenturing us for our benefit. Because you see, we were supposed to be uncivilized. So to be in the mere presence of these enlightened souls from Europe, never mind they were lashing us with whips or breaking us on the racks or torturing us with spears. No, they were civilizing us, you see, and we were supposed to be grateful. So to come back to your question frontally, in my mind, and I'm old enough to have been in high school, about to write what in those days we called GCE in 1966 when we got independence. And we all assumed, because we were all studying West Indian history in school, there was a book by Parry and Sherlock, a blue covered book.
That's right.
It's called Introduction to West Indian History or some such thing. And if you glance through the book, there was so little on Indian immigration, Indian indentureship, that didn't amount to more than 6 or 7 pages. And I remember as a boy, us, how do I put it, railing against this and trying to find out. Because I grew up with my Nana and Nani. Nana was born in 1896. Nani was born in 1900. And their parents had come from India. So they spoke to me at home about so much of that history on a first-hand basis. And it was so interesting. I've always wondered, why wasn't it in the books? So yes, Dr. Visram, the education of our people must include what our indentureship and enslavement periods were like. Because they say, unless you know your history, you are doomed to repeat it. And we see it happening today, where some of us may say that they are what one ex-president of Ghana, the first president, called neo-colonialism, that the same colonial relations could be repeating themselves on the modern condition. So the education should be about the past and how it now might live on in the present, and then give us the tools that we may overcome them in this present and become really emancipated, become really free, and become really independent.
I taught in the U.S. for over 35 years, and initially when I was teaching, there was not much on slavery, and as time went on, there was more and more discussion on slavery. And in recent years, not only has there been a focus on slavery, but on indentureship as well, Chinese indentureship, Irish indentureship, the history of the present with the Italian people and other groups. So everyone, history is being taught in schools in America. But here in Guyana, that has not been the case, unfortunately. I don't know if that will ever change, whether the government, regardless of which government is in office, will focus on the history of the presence of the various groups in Guyana.
It will only change, Dr. Bisram, if we, the people, point it out, that if a government has to listen to its people, if for nothing else, but it wants them to vote for them, vote them into office. So on either side of our divide, and sadly we still have a divide, we should be pushing for this kind of education, and it will have to happen.
Now, the government every year expends significant amount of money on the commemoration, celebration, observance of Emancipation Day. And there's been a lot of, this year and last year as well, a lot of complaints, comments, negative responses by African people, whether it's justified or not, of the government's involvement in commemorative activities of Emancipation Day. They felt the government should not participate in it, in these activities. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also I'd like to make a point after that about the government support for indentureship commemoration. First, on slavery,
Well, what we see
emancipation?
happening in Guyana, and this is why we can't pretend to be surprised. In Guyana, almost every action in the public sphere is politicized. That's the reality of Guyana, very, very sadly, because the groups that are competing for power are so evenly matched. Every event, those in politics see how they can gain some political benefit from it. And it goes on both sides, like I said, of the divide. So no one should try to pretend they are Simon Pure and they're above this kind of politicking. We may say, well, certain activities should be above the fray. But we see in the commemoration of these activities, the individuals themselves who are commemorating it have politicized it. Take, for example, the commemoration of Emancipation Day in Buxton. When I first returned to Guyana around 1989 or so, I spent most of my time politically with the WPA, would visit the WPA office quite often. And in fact, one of my earliest requests was to Mr. Koyana, if he could introduce me to the individuals who ran the 1st of August Emancipation Commemoration in Buxton. For whatever reason, I never got to meet the group, but there was a group that was commemorating Emancipation Day in Buxton. And Mr. Koyana spoke to me about it, that the PNC themselves saw Buxton as being more WPA, and the PNC did not do anything for Emancipation Day in Buxton. The Buxtonians did it on their own. So in that early stage, there was that political awareness of what we may call, how would I put it, cultural events. And in the village itself, I understand, even though the politicians may have a particular position, all the people of that village commemorated together. The same in Iceland, my village. That is my memory of it, that everybody got together. But in my village, there wasn't any major WPA presence in Iceland. There was a bit of a presence. So to come back to your point, in this year, there is this quarrel as if that the PPP is politicizing the event by giving subventions to particular African groups. But what I would say is this, that whether those groups are PNC or PPP, once they are of African origin and they're being given funds to commemorate Emancipation Day, that is very, very important, because they are being given funds to commemorate their activity that they have an inheritance of. As to the political implications, that's left to the individual to make their political choice when they enter that voting booth, where they will be all alone with that pencil to mark their X. That is my position on that.
Now, I don't remember or recollect the government, the PPP administration, expending large amounts of money on Indian Arrival Day over the years. I do remember when the coalition was in office, the coalition did offer some subventions to some East Indian organizations, and most of them rejected the funds for whatever reasons. They were advised and appealed to not to accept the money. But in the change of administration, I don't know if the PPP administration has expended or given subventions to Indian organizations to observe Indian Arrival Day. But it is my view that government should support these kinds of activities that cultural organizations are organizing to commemorate to whatever ethnic observances they have. I'm not saying religious observances, but certainly ethnic observances. What's your take on that?
Well, specifically on Indian Arrival Day, I'm old enough to remember in the 60s when Dr. Balwant Singh sponsored Ramakan Day, and out in the Gandhi Youth Organization up at Thomas Lands, there were some commemoration there, and that didn't spread all across the country as in a mass way, but the awareness was there, especially in youths like myself who took an interest in these matters. Later, I remember Pandit Ripudaman Prasad of the Dharmic Sabha. He sponsored Arrival Day. They used to call them Immigration Day celebration. That's right. By then. They didn't call it Arrival Day. They call it Immigration Day commemoration. And they even did it at my village of Iflat at the Mandir grounds. That was done in a big way. And it continued into the 90s. I remember attending one of them, being invited by Pandit Ripudaman and presenting a plaque that was supposed to have been delivered to him in New York for the Gopio. He couldn't attend. So to come back to that, all of these commemorations were privately sponsored and privately upkept. When in the 2000, we began to call for Indian Arrival Day, and we remember
as a holiday,
as a holiday, and we gave it that name. We held one of the first commemoration at Everest Ground, which was the East Indian Cricket Club ground, the original name, until they were forced to change it by the PNC to Everest. We held it at that ground, and we got a massive outpouring of support. Over 20,000 people came. And then we had a second one over in West Demerara, same reaction on that. And no, it was not supported by the PPP. In fact, the PPP felt threatened. And recently, I saw my good friend Evan Prasad write on his Facebook page that the IAC, of which he was one of the official, he along with Robert Prasad, they were officials of it, that the ISC, Indian Action Committee was called then, or the Indian Arrival Committee first. It was formed explicitly to take on the Jihad commemoration. So rather than supporting it, the PPP actually tried to have their own function, in a sense to have people of Indian origin go to a quote-unquote PPP affiliated activity. So I think basically what is happening now is, again, too much of a storm in a teacup. I don't think, for example, the race question has been thrown out that the PPP are called slave catchers, to be out, having Africans take money and then broad issue. It's not like that. The PPP has done this with Indian organizations also. We never got a penny. Jihad never got a penny in his lifetime, and eventually that had to fold for lack of, I guess, manpower and sponsorship. To come back to your thing under the what you call
coalition.
It, coalition. I must say, without any request, Ryan Shaw and myself had participated in end of indentureship conference in which people from the government had participated at the National Conference Center. And we got an offer of $500,000 for whatever activity we were going to be doing. That happened in March, and this was going to be for May. And at that point, the government had also shut down Wales and at that juncture. And we returned the money, and we told them very clearly that we do not see how we could accept funds from a government that was going to be throwing thousands of Indian sugar workers at an event that is tied to their arrival. And I remember the Minister of Culture being very polite about accepting that, and we had a good discussion, and she took it in good stead.
Well, I think we have had enough discussion on emancipation and followed by indentureship. And I'd like to reflect a little bit on the elections in neighboring Venezuela. As the country would have known by now, there was an election on July 28. The opposition claimed victory, and the government claimed victory. I think there is now some violence in Venezuela. I wonder if you could, comment. You have written profusely on this subject matter about Venezuela and its claim to our territory, and so I was just wondering, what do you see as the implications of the elections and vis-a-vis Guyana?
First of all, we must, from the very onset, and I say we Guyanese, doesn't matter what our political persuasion is, we must be united on this question. Venezuela presents a clear and present danger to our very existence. And if emancipation and the end of indentureship are to mean anything which should be independence, then Venezuela presents a threat to that. Why? We know, and this is not theory anymore, we have a government in Venezuela that has actually passed legislation to annex means to take over all of our Essequibo, 2/3 of our national territory. They're not satisfied with having taken over and occupied our half of Ankoko Island, which was given to us at the demarcation in 1899. No, they now want all of Essequibo, and they have now acted. I have defined that as an act of war. It is an act of war, and therefore it will not go away. It doesn't matter who rules Guyana, it is there. But what we know for sure is that Maduro has drummed up this border controversy that they created back in 1962. And he has raised it and he has pursued it with a vengeance, making very, very, very clear and dangerous actions. So when we come to this election, which Maduro has claimed to have won, the implications are very, very important for us. Because for sure, while we may not trust his opponent, right, who said that she will not take a hard stand on it, that is left to be seen. But we know for sure that Maduro has a particular position on our Essequibo. So we should be interested as to who is in Miraflores Palace in Venezuela. That's where the president lives. So to come back to the claims and counterclaims in Venezuela, we in Guyana, who have lived through 28 years of rigging during the PNC years, and who lived through the 1920 attempted rigging, for which the perpetrators
2020.
The 2020 attempted rigging, for which the perpetrators are presently on the trial as we speak. We should have an insight as to what's going on in Venezuela, because what we know to rig elections, you have to be prepared. It's like the 3-card Monte that you play. Now you see it, now you don't. You have to have your action planned ahead, and you have to have your people in the audience to divert people's attention and so on. So when you look at what has happened in Venezuela before the election, the most powerful opponent, right, of Maduro was disqualified by the Supreme Court from running, right? She was disqualified from running. Maria, what's her last name?
Machado.
Maria Machado. She was disqualified. Who disqualified her? The Supreme Court. Who is the Supreme Court of Venezuela? Well, in 2022, just 2 years ago, Maduro redefined the Supreme Court of Venezuela. It was 32 members. He stripped it of 12, kept those who had shown by their judgments that they were loyal to him, and there are only 2 members of the present 20-member Supreme Court who have gone against Maduro and some of his antics. So when we talk of today, we heard Maduro saying, you know what, we'll have our Supreme Court examine and audit, he used the word audit, the ballots. You're talking of the game is already fixed. And we saw that when I was a boy of Burnham, already fixing the Elections Commission with Jackman and who was the white guy? I forget his name. But the point is that they were already fixed as to what they will say about the rigging. That is where the Supreme is already fixed. So we have a situation where for the last 2 years, Maduro has been arranging for what we call an outcome determinative action that they now call an election. People of Venezuela are out in the streets as we speak. At least 12 of them have been killed already. Tear gas and rubber bullets are being used indiscriminately because it is the army that will have the final say in all of this. And we have to ask the question, who is the army? They're under the control of Maduro. In all of the hard guava season that Venezuela has been facing, Maduro has rewarded the top ranks of the army. He has rewarded them with positions controlling most of the industries in Venezuela. He has rewarded them with all kinds of perks. And the head of the army is a personal friend and loyalist to him. So the opposition will get no satisfaction, as we say in Ghana, when they look to the army. The army is not a neutral arbitrator in all of this. It is committed and from the days of Chavez, who rose out of the army to seize power and to change the constitution so that all and most of the institutions by this new constitution that was promulgated in 1999 by Chavez are all institutions that they control. So this election, I think the free world has to stand up and take cognizance, because we are seeing across the world that if you don't stand up for democracy, it is a very fragile institution that can be blown away by men like Maduro. And in general, we don't need people like him. And in particular, because of his threat to Guyana, we must do all we can in our powers to get rid of him.
And one must not forget, there are a large number of Venezuelans who are living in Guyana. By one estimate, it's over 50,000. And I believe it's some 8 or 9 million Venezuelans have migrated out of the country to its neighbors, as well as to the United States, where over 4.5 million migrated over the last few years. So it has deep implication. The lack of democracy has very, very deep implication. People are migrating, mostly and primarily as economic migrants. The economy is in terrible shape. It's on the verge of collapse. And so it's important that democracy be restored in Venezuela. Any further comment you want to make about that?
Well, it shows you that words like democracy are not just academic terms. We saw that, Dr. Bisram, in our own case, and that is the irony of Venezuela and Brazil. Every mistake that Mr. Burnham made, maybe with good intentions, I don't know what went on in his mind. Maybe Mr. Burnham was very well intentioned and wanted to empower ordinary supporters of his. And Chavez started out like that. When he took over, yes, there was an oligarchy ruling Venezuela, and there was widespread poverty, even though it was the most developed state in Latin America. It was wise. We have to concede that. But the point is that in going about the policies of just trying to distribute wealth willy-nilly to those who are poor, it may work for a while. This kind of populist approach appears to be very, very attractive. People will like you when you're giving them handouts, when
That's
you're
right.
all kinds of things. But the question responsible leaders have to ask is that, is it sustainable? Mr. Burnham did the same thing in Guyana. He formed the cooperative movement. For the smaller supporters, he founded the co-op bank to hand out loans to people of his party who want to get into business and so on. Did all kinds of things, nationalized sugar, nationalized bauxite, where the people were supposed to govern. But in the bottom line, if you do not run these corporations on certain principles, where something that you don't want to talk about, which is profits, where profits can be made, then it's going to fall into the ground. And that's what happened in Venezuela. And we hear the same thing in Guyana today. Take, for example, the oil industry was propping up Venezuela. Chavez decides that he was going to nationalize the oil industry. And for example, Exxon and so on were going to be given a very minuscule portion of profits. Now, they had made huge investments. We see what it is today to have an oil operation. It's not peanuts. And more importantly than the finance is the expertise, is the marketing expertise, is all the ancillary activities that go into oil production, especially for Venezuela, which has very, very heavy crude oil laden with sulfur. It takes a lot of processing to do that. So when people like Exxon and Conoco and Chevron left, PVSA, the Venezuelan oil company, you own everything, but you own everything of what? It's like you own 100% of what? You can't run it. So it fell into the ground. And Venezuela then collapsed internally. Sure, the Americans later had some sanctions, but by the time the sanctions were applied to enforce democracy by 2018 or so, the economy had already collapsed and millions are on the move. So what you have is this whole cascading domino effect, where you have over 5 million Venezuelans in Colombia. Can Colombia absorb that kind of numbers? Brazil has them in all their favelas. You have them in Chile, as you know, you just mentioned, across the American border. I've been in New York for a couple of months, and they're all over New York City, whether in Manhattan or whether in Queens. They're all over the place, scrounging. You go into the subway, they're all over the subways with little kids on their back hawking, and kids with kids on their backs hawking candy and all that, for sale to make a living. The question is that we must ask ourselves in terms of these populist movements. Are they sustainable? So we come back to Venezuela now, that we see that unless we do something about it, the 50,000 that we are seeing in Guyana today, or the 60,000, is a drop in the bucket. When you're talking 8 million people having left Venezuela. I looked at some of the telecasts coming out of Brazil, and I see so many young people crying when they heard the news that Maduro will take over again, to say, all my family have left, and we have to now go and join them. And now, unlike America with 300 million people, unlike Brazil with about the same number of people, we in Guyana cannot absorb those numbers. We are not even 1 million people. So you're talking of a potential demographic change that will have far-reaching consequences in Guyana. Already, I live on West Coast, and there are so many Venezuelans in every village, and in all manner of ways they are affecting our lifestyle. We hear of murders of these Venezuelan women. We hear of prostitution and them being killed and so on. We're only seeing the beginning of something. So yes, we are going to be affected in so many ways by this election in Venezuela, and we should get with the program and see that Maduro is out.
Okay. While you were commenting, I was overhearing these loud noises of fireworks going out, hundreds of them. So the celebration has started for commemoration of emancipation activities. So if you could summarize any final comments, words on Emancipation Day activities.
Okay, thanks a lot, Doc. Yes, in terms of emancipation, all Guyana should recognize the seminal import of this act in our nation building efforts. And I commend the government for, in whichever way they can. They may look at it from a political angle. I have no doubt that that's how the PPP operates. But I commend them for supporting the activities, because those events have a life of their own. And once individuals now begin to commemorate it, it's very difficult to stop. I remember as a boy passing through, as I said, the Kashmir section of my village to my home in Eiffel Pasture, and I saw the very first Ghana Day celebration. I believe was in 1958, the year after, I believe. I don't think it happened the first year. I think it happened the second year in 1858. And that continued in my village. And I think the same thing with Emancipation Day that have now been stirred by the PPP. So again, we should recognize the import of this event in our nation building. And I commend everyone who assists in it in the same manner as I commend everyone who should participate and support, including the PPP government. Yeah, please, please, please try to buy out some Indians and support Indian immigration arrival day. Please do it. Because I know, like I said, it'll take on an event of its own. In terms of the Venezuelan situation, I just want to emphasize, without sounding too dramatic, that we will have to draw the line as to what Venezuela represents to us, because the ICJ judgment will come down. Here's a man who has the gall to say he does not recognize the International Court of Justice in what he'll say. So we know ahead of the game what will happen. And in our own backyard of Carrickmore, we should take note of Mr. Ralph Gonsalves, who, without even asking for the proof, imagine Colombia, a leftist president of Colombia, asked for the proof of what Maduro is saying. Lula, a leftist president, asked for proof. We're not talking about the Americans who may have their own axe to grind. I'm talking of two Latin American powerhouses, you understand, who are leftist bent, who have stood behind Maduro, who have supported him to say, at least give us the proof. And yet you have Mr. Ralph Gonsalves, who is supposed to be a friend of Guyana, a friend of our president and vice president, coming out unapologetically and enthusiastically supporting and commending Maduro. This cannot stand, and we should make our position known to Mr. Gonsalves in going forward. I'm not saying we should not have helped with the hurricane as we did, but I would like Ralph to know or ask, how much did Maduro send for his hurricane? We in Guyana did send a shipload of stuff, but you don't look as to what you send. What is the thought that counts? That
That's
we
right.
see ourselves as a Caribbean people, and I would have hoped that Mr. Gonsalves would have conducted himself with a little more decorum. The money that they're getting through Petro-Carib, the debt write-off that they got through Petro-Carib from Maduro, they should not be bought. That's the 30 pieces of silver. And it stinks to high heaven. So that is my concluding statements. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much. I'll let that be the last and final word for tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight and this very, very interesting discussion from our main speaker, Mr. Ravindra Dev, on Emancipation Day and the Venezuelan election. Good night, all.
Thank you.